What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. I'm joined by your favorite beat reporter, Chris Fedor. Chris, how is it going, man?
Going great, man. Beautiful day outside before the rain came, so snuck that in. A little outdoor time with my son. My wife is going to be leaving for Nashville throughout this weekend, actually. She's going to go see her friend from college, so she's going to be away for the weekend, and it's going to be a whole lot of me and Elliot time, and we're just preparing for that, I guess. It's one of her first times away since Elliot was born, so it should be interesting.
I was about to say, it's about time Miss Fedor got some break from you too, because you know how the season goes. You be on the road all the time. It's about time she gets to hang out in Nashville. Is a great time. I mean, lots of good music out there, good hanging spots. So that's great. Let's love to hear that. Love to hear it. Are you ready to be solo dolo with your son? Like, that's different.
It is different. It'll be, I think my third separate time. Shortly after he was born, then she went to Seattle for a wedding. So yeah, I'm ready. I don't know if he's ready. He's routine oriented. That's the thing about Elliot. He likes things the way that they are. He likes to know when people are going to be around. He likes to know when he's going to eat and have his snack, and all of that stuff is basically planned out. And for a lot of the season, especially during NBA season with the Cavs and me traveling so much, Mama wakes him up in the morning or Mama wakes him up from a nap. So it'll be interesting to see how he reacts to the fact that it's going to be me doing that and not her. Let's hope it goes well.
I feel like it will. It's gonna be a lot of toy truck driving, I feel.
Yeah.
But speaking of truck driving, Chris, I'm getting better and better with these transitions, man. We're going to be talking about a player that goes by the nickname the G-Wagon, or as some may know him better by the minivan. But Cavs fans know him as the G-Wagon, and we're talking about Georges Niang, a guy who played 82 straight games during the regular season and actually didn't have that good of a run in the playoffs to the point where he had to be sat for a couple of games and then got some DNPs. So, Chris, that's where I want to start with this guy, with Georges Niang, someone who the Cavs relied on so heavily when it came to regular season production, spacing, and they went and got him because they knew that they needed more shooting, they needed more veteran leadership, and they needed more toughness. And Georges Niang was supposed to bring all of that, and in the playoffs, he kind of just went away. He wasn't as effective against the teams that we saw them matched up with. Orlando Magic and the Boston Celtics are not prime matchups for somebody of Georges Niang's stature or athleticism. But I want to get your thoughts on this main topic, Chris. Do you feel like the performance and the lack of production from Georges Niang in the playoffs negates his process and what he brought to the team during the regular season? And like I said, he played every single game during the regular year.
Yeah, I don't think it negates it completely, Ethan. But I think it puts in perspective, and I think it shows the clear difference between an 82-game player and a 16-game player. And some guys are 82-game players, and some guys are 16-game players. And I just think the flaws that George has, especially on the defensive end of the floor, his foot speed, his if he's not making shots from the perimeter, if he's not being an asset on the offensive end of the floor, it's hard to justify consistent minutes for him in a playoff environment when that is so much about matchups. That is so much about the opponent attacking one guy over and over and over again. And if they see a weakness and if they see a weak point on defense, they're going to try and continue to exploit that in a different kind of way in the playoffs, where it's about game planning, where it's about adjusting and all that kind of stuff. The regular season, he was a big-time asset. They needed him. They needed him to survive some long stretches without Evan Mobley. They needed him to survive some long stretches without Dean Wade. They needed him to provide some stability and consistency off the bench from a scoring perspective, Because we talked about this, Ethan. Last year, the Cavs had the third worst scoring bench in the entire NBA. That couldn't happen again. And they went out and they tried to address that. And George was a big part of that with the consistent production that he brought off the bench from a scoring standpoint. And they became a top half of the league bench group. You can't ignore those kinds of things because that helped the Cavs get to 48 wins. That helped the Cavs get to the fourth seed in the Eastern Conference in a favorable matchup against the Orlando Magic in round one. If George isn't here to do that, are they the four seed? Do they get Orlando in round one? Like, all of those things have to be taken into account. But I think it's pretty clear that, there's a reason why throughout the course of his career, teams, whether it was Utah, whether it was Philadelphia, they went away from him a lot once the playoffs arrived because they understand his limitations. They understand his weaknesses just like the opponent does, and the opponent is going to continue to exploit those, and that's what happened.
Yeah, Chris. And I mean, you mentioned his offensive productivity and what he brought as a shooter. And I mean, that's all well and dandy, but we also talked about Dean Wade and how he's the opposite side of the coin when it comes to defense. So I want to take a look at Georges Niang's stats on both sides of the ball and get a better understanding of where he fell for the Cavs and for himself. And then I actually sent out a text to our subtexters with the same question that I asked you, and we're going to go through some of their responses and maybe some of their questions for how Georges Niang falls for the Cavs after that good regular season and pretty poor playoff season. So when you look at Georges Niang's stats when it comes to shooting, he shot 37.6% from three-point range. That's the worst he's shot since his first two seasons in the league. Every other season since he's been in the NBA, he's shot 40% outside of the first two seasons he was in the league, where he combined for 32 games. So I really don't even want to think about those two seasons when he was with Indiana and his first season with Utah. Right. But then you look at his production as just field goal percentage. He was 44.9%, which is actually better than he had in the last 5 seasons, if I'm not mistaken. And you also look at what he was able to do just with the ball in his hands, but also thinking about what his mindset was with spacing the floor as a 4, because we know him to be a primary power forward. He was tasked with playing center at some points. He was tasked with playing small forward at points, depending on who was on the court and who was available for the Cavs. But you also got to think about the defense and how that affected the Cavs as well, because we can't just look at one side of the court. So when you look at the defensive ratings for the Cavs, and we talked about Dean Wade in yesterday's podcast being the number one person on the Cavs, then you change the spectrum and you try to look at Georges Niang, and with Georges Niang on the floor, the Cavs had the 4th worst defensive rating of any player that they had on the court. That includes Isaiah Mobley, Tristan Thompson, all of those guys. So the rankings go, and I feel bad saying this because we know how little this guy played, but Ty Jerome at 143.8 defensive rating, Amani Bates at 124, Marcus Morris Sr. at 116.3, and then it's Georges Niang at 113.9. So not necessarily anything to smile at in that department. That's for the regular season. And then you go over to the playoffs and you take a look at what he was able to do defensively, and that's more of a lackluster look, because you think about his offensive rating, and he was actually during the regular season top 5 for the Cavs. The Cavs had a top 5 offensive rating when he was on the court, but playoffs wise, it's a whole different beast, Chris. And we both know this, and we understand how different it can be for guys. And his defensive rating, he was still 4th worst, but he was 113 for the Cavs, and his offensive rating, he fell all the way down to 10th on that list at 101.2. So his net rating during the playoffs was negative 11.7, which is not something that you want to look at for someone who the Cavs went and got for a playoff atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers will point to it, Ethan. They were statistically a better basketball team when he was off the floor as opposed to when he was on the floor. And I think in some cases, the eye test certainly passes that. And that's not just in the playoffs. That was in the regular season overall. Um, I think in an honest moment, the Cavs would say that they didn't get out of George what they expected to get out of him when they made that signing. And the fact that, he is the eighth highest paid player on the roster, it's not the kind of contract that is going to kill them, right? It's not the kind of contract that is going to rob them of financial flexibility. It's not the kind of contract that is going to prevent them from making other moves that they would need to make moving forward. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes you see a big bloated contract, somebody who's getting paid 25 to 30 million dollars, and they're just not living up to that contract, and it really affects everything else that the organization can do to try and put a roster in place that can compete, right? So his number is not one that is crippling to this team, but he certainly didn't live up to that number, right? He didn't live up to that signing. He wasn't as effective of a player during the regular season and the postseason as somebody that the Cavs targeted, early on in free agency. I would think that they would want more from George. And I think his biggest impact, honestly, Ethan, came behind the scenes. The leadership that he showed, his ability to understand it's an 82 game grind, when to make it loose, when to crack jokes, when to be strict, when to hold guys accountable. And his voice mattered. Even though he wasn't making shots, even though he was getting picked on the defensive end of the floor, there was enough respect for George in that locker room that when he was seeing something that wasn't going well, and I wrote about this early on in the season, they were on a road trip. They were in Golden State. They were practicing about 45 minutes away from where they played the game. And during one of the practices, after everything was broken down by JB Bickerstaff, Georges Niang decided that he wanted to speak up, and he said something along the lines of, you cannot take these kinds of seasons and these kinds of teams for granted. You can't just assume that you're going to make the playoffs because you made the playoffs last year, right? We have to take things a little bit more seriously. We have to understand how important the regular season is when it comes to building habits. And that was an example of a guy speaking up because he saw things that he didn't like, and he wanted those to change. And shortly after that, the Cavs went on their run. And I think that was part of, George holding everybody accountable and trying to make the team live up to a specific standard. He has been there before, right? He knows what a playoff team looks like. He knows what a championship level team looks like. He knows what it takes during the regular season to get to that point where a team is prepared to make a postseason run of however long it was going to go. And because of that, and because of his playoff experience, and because of his voice that mattered behind the scenes, you could tell that the value he brought to this team extended beyond the court. So I don't think from a productivity standpoint, he was the guy that the Cavs signed early on in free agency. And it shows you just how delicate this is, right? If George isn't going to shoot consistently in the 40% from 3-point range, then the weaknesses become magnified. So if he doesn't shoot better moving forward, I think we're going to have the same kinds of questions about George and the same kinds of concerns about George and how playable he becomes and whether he should be an every night fixture of this rotation.
Yeah, Chris, and I think it's Georges Niang is one of those guys where the 82 game season is like important, but you definitely look more at what he's doing in the playoffs. Just like we talk about this Cavs team, like it's the regular season, but like we know that the goal is to get to the playoffs and how good they're going to perform when they get there. Mm-hmm. And George, we know that he can play 82 games now. We know that he is going to be a consistent guy for them. Obviously, he needs to shoot better. That's no doubt about it. But him being there and being a consistent factor for them is telling, because you earn respect. You earn just people understand that you can do what your job is. And if you can do that for an 82 game season, you gain more rapport. And then when you get to the playoffs, then it's like, okay, show us it. But in this case, it's like, we don't care as much if you are not going to perform in the playoffs, because that's what we brought you here to do. And
Right.
I think the other thing when it comes to that is what you talked about, the intangibles that Georges Niang brings, and it helps his case for not being in a trade package this summer, because he is able to keep this group together, and he is able to also, just like you said, keep it light, keep it fun in moments that you need to, but also continue to have a strict hold on when you need to say what you need to say, and having the respect to do so. Like,
Yeah.
I remember, like, Georges Niang will go back and forth with fans, and then he'll come back into the, like, with a grit face on, and then he'll come back into the locker room and joke about it afterwards. Like,
Yeah.
that's the kind of, like, difference that you need from a player of Georges Niang's stature. And that's what I wanted to start with when it comes to our subtext questions and getting into those, because one of the last ones that we got before we started on this podcast had to do with his relationships with people in the organization and also with his teammates. And I think this one is the biggest one.
Mm-hmm.
This subtexter said, Ethan, feels like I have heard on several occasions that Niang is as close to Donovan Mitchell as anyone on this team. Would you agree with that? And doesn't that truly help his position on this team? Well, we mentioned it before the season really started that Donovan Mitchell went and got Georges Niang. He was a confidant that somebody that Georges Niang was going to be coming onto this team and be able to bring more than just shooting. But Chris, I want to get your thoughts on how close that relationship is, especially after Donovan's second season in Cleveland.
Oh, it's a strong relationship. There's no doubt about it. George is somebody that Donovan trusts. George is somebody that Donovan understands was going to fit well behind the scenes. George is somebody that Donovan listens to. And it's not a surprise to me that throughout the course of last offseason, when it came to free agency and putting together a target list, and Donovan being part of the recruitment process, that he went out and addressed a need to bring in a guy like George for a variety of different reasons. And it's not surprising to me that he went and vouched for George and said, this is somebody who would be a good fit for us, both on the court and off the court. So I do think it's a strong relationship. And I think the fact that Donovan went out and recruited him last offseason during free agency certainly speaks to that. And I think you could see their relationship throughout the course of the year, both behind the scenes and on the floor. You could see that clear as day. You could hear the comments from Donovan about how important George was. And so many people had different phrases to describe George. People called him the life of the team. People called him an enforcer. People called him, various things that were all affectionate terms that were things that mattered to the growth of this team. And you brought up something that I do think is interesting, and it's something that the Cavs are going to have to consider. Because of what he meant behind the scenes, like, you have to attach some level of value to that. How much is always the complicated thing. It's, do you feel like you can find enough leadership elsewhere, right? Do you feel like you can find enough guys who are going to hold people accountable elsewhere? Do you feel like now you have enough playoff experience throughout the course of your roster that you don't need to lean on guys like Georges Niang as much, Tristan Thompson, Marcus Morris Sr., who was signed midway through the season? Like, all those signings were about a lot of different things, and part of that was about the playoff experience, because there just wasn't a lot of it on this roster. But now Darius has been to the conference semifinals, and Isaac Okoro has more experience, and Jared Allen has more experience. And you go down the list and you start seeing that these guys have been in these kinds of environments and may not need to lean on these guys the same way that they did this past year. And it brings me to this, Ethan. We talked about his contract. Like, it's not one that is crippling. It's about $8 million per year. That can be salary filler in a trade, attractive salary filler in a trade. Because if the Cavs viewed George for some of those intangible things, another team could see him the same kind of way. Or maybe another team says, hey, we need some floor spacing. We need some shooting from the power forward spot to help us go from play-in team to playoff team, to help us go from outside the playoff picture completely to play-in / playoff team, whatever it may be. So I would not rule out the Cavs potentially attaching George to a deal this offseason if that's the direction that they go and they determine that they want to shake up their roster. For example, this is just hypothetical. I'm not reporting this. I'm not saying that I've heard this from reliable sources or anything. But Jared Allen makes $20 million a year. Jared Allen is somebody who has drawn interest from a lot of teams around the NBA in the past, and he's going to draw interest again this offseason. We've talked about some of the teams that make sense, Golden State being one of them. Hypothetically, Andrew Wiggins makes $24 million. $24 million and $20 million doesn't match. So now you start thinking about some ancillary pieces that you can put into these deals to make the salary match a little bit better. Or, as we've talked about, Brandon Ingram over and over and over again. Because like any two-way wing with a pulse that can play quality basketball is going to be on the Cavs' radar and is going to be linked to the Cavs, and rightfully so. But Brandon Ingram makes $33 million. So if you're talking about a potential Jared Allen for Brandon Ingram framework, that's not going to work financially. But all of a sudden, you throw in Niang's $8+ million contract, and you're a lot closer to Brandon Ingram's $33 million, right? So salary aggregation is something that could matter here as we move forward for the Cavs when it comes to potential moves this offseason. And George, that is a salary that could potentially be attractive in that kind of deal. I'm not saying that the Cavs are going that direction for sure. I'm not saying that the Cavs have had those conversations for sure, but it's something to consider.
Chris, can I just say I love when we fire up the hypothetical trade machine. Just get it going. Get it running.
Who doesn't love that? I mean, we're going to have to do a whole podcast at some point this offseason, Ethan, dedicated to hypothetical trades that work in the trade machine involving Darius Garland and Jared Allen. Like, that podcast is happening, and it is coming because that's something that people want.
I'm going to have to hit the subtexters up to get the breakdown on who they want to be thrown into the trade machine, because I feel like at this point there's some people in our subtext and some fans regularly on social media, they're like, throw everybody in the trade machine and see what sticks. So we'll have to see if that ends up being something that we do. It more than likely will, like Chris said. But I wanted to get into more of these subtext responses. There are a good amount that are not questions, so I'm going to run through those, and then when we get to a question, we're going to stop and answer it. So let's get to it. We're going to start from the bottom and work our way up. The first one, man, these subtexts is right on cue. George needs to get in much better shape. Wouldn't be surprised if he is a salary filler in a trade. He, along with Strus, were brought in to attempt to push the team over the top after last year's shooting woes. They failed to do that. I don't think his lack of production negates his performance because he gave the team a sense of edge and grit. Oh, hold on. Edge and grit that we needed at times. People said we were soft last year. He helped make us not take as much S word. Can't be a team full of nice guys in this league. That comes from Ricardo from Atlanta. We appreciate you, Ricardo, for attaching your name to that one. Yep. In the 2023 playoffs, the Cavs were labeled as soft. Despite his poor playoff performance, George brings an attitude that was missing. Think Udonis Haslem type influence. Okay, not a name I would have compared George to yet, but sure, that goes there. Coaching malpractice was what hurt Niang. We relied on him too much, and proper, bold, and in all caps, proper development and trust Sam Merrill comes to mind, and others to do more would have predicated in Niang, but being a sub properly deployed. All right, I'm going to read that again because I just messed that whole thing up. Coaching malpractice was what hurt Niang. We relied on him too much, and proper development and trust, parentheses, Merrill comes to mind, parentheses, and others to do more would have predicated in Niang being a sub properly deployed. All right. That's from Andrew in Cleveland Heights. Any indication from Niang that he plans to use the offseason to lose the spare tire he played with last season and disappeared in the playoffs? I would package him with J.A. or Darius in a trade. Okay? Well, we just talked about that. Look at that. It's okay that Niang is a regular season player and is ill-fitted for the playoffs. You need a guy that can help you bank wins for seeding in regular season and is a positive influence in the locker room. Talked about that.
That's the other thing. I think we have to put this in perspective, right? We're talking about like the 8th, 9th guy in the rotation. We're not talking about a starter quality power forward. We know that Georges Niang is not going to be a starter quality power forward. We know that he's not going to be a 30-minute a night guy like Evan Mobley, like Jared Allen, like Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell. We know that he's not going to be a high volume scorer. We know that, there are limitations that he has at both ends of the floor. But we have to understand that there's a specific role that he plays for this team. And it's okay to talk negatively about him because he did not play well in the playoffs. And there were times in the regular season that you were wondering, hey, when we get to the playoffs, is he going to be in the rotation? Can he hold up defensively? All those different questions definitely exist. But we also do have to put it in perspective that the expectations for George, they weren't as high, and they shouldn't be attached to him the same way that they're attached to some of these other guys, right? If we're being fair about it.
Yeah, and so just for people that are tuning in now, this is the question that I went back to when I was asking Chris at the beginning. Does the regular season George just go away? Do you forget that when we talk about playoff George? And I asked this to our subtexters, and we're going through that.
George? Because, is playoff George a thing?
No, it is not. Not after this year, it's not. Right. But I don't think his career has pointed to that either, Chris. Right. But so some people have said the same kind of thing. The next person said Niang is a great bench piece for the regular season. He isn't a player that can play long stretches or every game during a playoff series. He's matchup dependent. That's basically what Chris said just now and what we went back to at the beginning of this podcast. I actually don't think he was that valuable, and I was frustrated by him playing more minutes than Dean Wade throughout the season. He was valuable when Dean Wade went down, but outside that, he's a fringe 10th man in a rotation on a good team at best. I mean, Chris, I think we keep hitting on these, so I'm gonna hit these last two, and we'll get out of here with this one.
Yep.
Georges Niang is an interesting situation because the Cavs lack an athletic 6'7" to 6'8" player. When needed, Niang was used that way. While in the regular season, that seems to work most of the time. In the playoffs, his weaknesses were exposed. Slow feet, weak on defense, especially versus athletic players, seem to have lost his outside shooting touch. So is it inconsistent, or was this the real Niang under pressure? A decent backup, but Cavs need an athletic wing. Yeah, and I think we can get into that a little bit more because we've talked about it on this podcast ad abundance about the need for the Cavs to, this offseason, if they decide to go away from the core four, to specifically go and look for a 3 to 4 that is probably 6, 7 and above, can play defense, can shoot the ball, 3-and-D kind of guy. And that's what we've been talking about that the Cavs need, because we've talked about Max Strus showed signs of being able to play the 3, but that's not his natural position. So being able to have somebody to jump into that role, even if they keep the core four with Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland, Evan Mobley, and Jared Allen. You might need a backup four that can do those things along with Dean Wade, because we talked about how he's capable of doing that, because you don't know what's going to happen with him this offseason and that lingering knee issue. But Chris, I just wanted to touch on what we thought was the best moment from Niang, and I don't think we have to get into the worst moment, because I think that whole playoff showing was basically that.
Was it against Milwaukee? I want to say it was against Milwaukee. It was the night that he just erupted.
Yeah, at home.
Yeah, at home. Like that was obviously an outlier, but him career high scoring, great shooting night, showed the idea of why the Cavs were so intrigued by him this past offseason. That's one that stands out to me. And I also think that moment at practice in the San Francisco area, I think that was pretty important too for the Cavs. I don't want to say that he was the driving force behind their turnaround, because that's a little bit too much. But when having conversations with a lot of people about that moment, and they didn't know how I learned it, they were kind of confused about how it got out and how I learned of it. But when I talked to them about it, they all talked about the importance of it. And they all talked about, like, that was kind of the first time really that they saw not George be that animated, but him basically showing a different way to impact the team. And they all thought that was pretty meaningful, that he said the right things, that he said the things that they needed to hear in that particular moment. Because if you remember, Ethan, they got off to a slow start. They were 4-6 through the first 10 games. They were hovering around 500, and then they turned it around. So I think those two come to mind. And one of them shows his on-court impact in terms of the shooting, in terms of the ability to score off the bench, the ability to be somebody who spaces the floor and make things easier on his teammates. And the other one shows, like, why I kept saying throughout the course of the season that it's risky for the Cavs to go away from George completely because of what he means to this team. And it goes beyond, all the other stuff that we talked about on the floor.
Yeah, Chris, and talking about his best performances, I definitely think back to that 33-point game against Milwaukee at home, where they played against the Giannis-less Bucks, and it was a showing for George from beyond the arc. And I mean, he was almost perfect from the field. I remember
Missed one shot.
I remember sitting in my seat, and everybody was like, is he going to go perfect? Is he going to go perfect? And then he took like a step back mid-range that he never takes. And everybody's like, what are you doing? You're perfect. And we talked to him afterwards, and he was like, I wasn't really thinking about it, but I knew it was a bad shot.
Yeah,
and I was like, come on. But I also think back to that 25-point game that he had against the Philadelphia 76ers. It's always great when you see a guy go against his former team and dominate and do what he basically showed them when he was there that he could do, and why they went and got him this season. So, yeah, I think George is someone that you got to look at coming into this next season, what the new coach is going to do and how he's going to reacclimate the system and choose how they're going to use Georges Niang. Especially, we got to talk about this speculatively, if he's still going to be on the team when the decisions are all said and done with this group. But, Chris, go ahead, Chris. Looks like you were about to say something.
I was. This has nothing to do with George specifically, but you said something that I think is really, really interesting. If the Cavs go the direction of shaking up the roster this offseason, there is a belief that, Jared Allen would be the most expendable of the core four. So if they do that, that means Evan Mobley moving to center full-time. That means a commitment to Evan playing full-time center. We've had so many different conversations, Ethan, about two-way wing. if they move Evan from the starting power forward spot, they are going to need a starter quality power forward, right? And I think if you squint, you can kind of see, if you squint hard enough, you can kind of see that with Dean Wade potentially, but I don't think so. And then it's not George either, right? Because of all of the reasons that we talked about on this podcast. I'm not saying, again, that the Cavs have talked about this particular player, and I'm not saying that everybody should start, going out and customizing his jersey or something along those lines. But Karl Anthony Towns is a name to monitor throughout the course of this offseason, especially if Minnesota decides that, they're going to do things a little bit differently when it comes to their roster construction, or if they're looking for a quote unquote scapegoat for what happened against the Dallas Mavericks. Cat wasn't very good in that series, not consistently anyway. There were moments where he disappeared, got in too much foul trouble, da-da-da-da-da. But if you're going to play Evan Mobley at full-time 5, you need a space-the-floor power forward. A starter quality space-the-floor power forward. And I just think that's too much for Dean, and you can't do it with George, especially coming off the playoff series that he had. So the Cavs, theoretically, would have to go out and fill that position with somebody else, right?
Yep.
Karl Anthony Towns is a name to watch there. I think Dorian Finney-Smith is a name to watch there as well. But if we're going to have these kinds of conversations about Jarrett Allen and the possibility of breaking up him and Evan Mobley, like, there isn't the answer internally. They would have to make subsequent moves after that to make the roster complete and make sense from that perspective again.
So I wrote about this for Friday, actually, about Dean Wade and his impactfulness, and we talked about it in the podcast yesterday about how he needs to be healthy and confident for the Cavs to make it to where they want to go. And I agree with you. I do not think that Dean Wade is a starting power forward for this team, especially how far they want to go. But I do think that his name would be in consideration, as we've talked about. And the other thing I want to say on this topic is I think he would push whoever is going to be the starting power forward for the Cavs to whatever next level that is, because of how competitive he is, because of how much he's just a workhorse. Like, his work ethic is bar none. And we got to see that, or the little bit of it, when he was trying to come back in that Boston Celtics series. He was doing everything, going through meticulous workouts, trying to get back and doing sprints. Like, I remember seeing him in a brace, but in a full-on sweat, but they would just show him doing work on the side, and okay, he's just doing something small, and I'm sitting there, I'm like, but why is he profusely sweating then? What did y'all have him doing before we got in here? So it's definitely thinking about what Dean Wade is going to bring, where Georges Niang is going to be at, what the Cavs do with Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen. But Karl Anthony Towns is definitely an interesting name to be thrown around. I mean, you mentioned it, the foul trouble in that series. Anthony Edwards, in every single post-game interview, was like, what did I tell you about the fouls? What did I tell you about the fouls? And it would be interesting, one, because of how well it looked like Anthony Edwards and Cat got along. I think they did almost every post-game presser together. And just thinking about that makes my head spin because of what Cat is as an offensive threat from beyond the arc. And I know we haven't talked about this enough, but, I mean, we've talked about how Evan Mobley, his game is inside, right? And he's growing his outside game. He's becoming a quote-unquote stretch four. It's going to take a little bit longer than everybody might expect, but he's working on it. I know we keep saying that if he's going to be a full-time 5, that they need to find an outside four guy.
Yeah.
How interesting would it be if Evan Mobley, the guy who has surprised almost everybody in every facet of his game, especially this season when he came back from the injury, which we thought was going to take more than 6 weeks, came back in 2 months, like, whatever. But if he just came back and was sniping from three-point range, like, I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't at this point because it's Evan Mobley. But it would be that I've always thought in the back of my head, what if Evan Mobley becomes that 4 that we've been talking about? It's unlikely, but I'm not going to count Evan Mobley out ever again. I've learned my lesson.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the questions that the Cavs are asking themselves. And when it comes to the viability of Jarrett and Evan, the thing that changes that most internally is Evan becoming that guy. And there is belief in Evan's outside shot. There is belief in Evan's perimeter game. And everybody will continue to point to the strides that he has already made in 3 seasons. He was more comfortable as a passer this year. He was more comfortable in DHOs. He was more comfortable as an offensive hub at the elbows. He was more comfortable this year shooting the 3-point shot and celebrating afterward. He was more comfortable in terms of rebounding the basketball and pushing in transition. The things that you need a 4 to do more frequently than what he was doing, he showed some comfort with those. And now it's about continuing to evolve. Now it's about continuing to add to his game. But that's something that the Cavs continue to say, Ethan, is, well, we don't have to break them up if Evan becomes this. If Evan gets the skill set that Karl Anthony Towns already has, that Kyle Kuzma already has, that, Andrew Wiggins in a small ball 4 lineup already has, any of these other names that you could throw out there, DeAndre Hunter of the Atlanta Hawks, that he already has, because Evan's only going into his 4th year. So, some of these guys that we're talking about are more seasoned, they're more advanced, but they should be, because they've been in the NBA longer. Like, if we were talking about them at the same stage of their development and of their career as Evan, would it be the same kind of conversation? Probably not. So that's something that the Cavs have to consider. Like, how close is Evan to becoming that guy? Is that a real thing that he can become that guy? Or is that just pie in the sky hope? You know what I'm saying? Like, this is the kind of offseason, Ethan, where the Cavs don't have to make moves just to make moves. They don't have to panic. They don't have to overreact. But they also can't lie to themselves, because it is too important of an offseason. There has to be an honest evaluation of this roster, just like there was an honest evaluation of JB Bickerstaff and whether he was the right guy moving forward. The front office, like, there are emotions attached to some of these guys because they either signed them in free agency, traded for them, or drafted them and tried to develop them, right? They've put in the time behind the scenes. They've invested in these particular players, but you have to try and take the emotions out of it, and you have to evaluate them as honestly as possible. And you can't sit here and continue to say, well, eventually it's going to happen where Evan becomes this, and then it's going to work better with him and Jarrett. You know what I mean? Like, at some point you need to see more evidence that he is going to be that level of comfortable. And the small strides that he showed this year, the ones that we already talked about, I don't know that that's enough. I don't know that that's enough that says, okay, it's going to happen this year or it's going to happen next year. You know what I mean? So I still think that the Cavs have to explore the possibility of splitting up Jarrett and Evan if they get the right things back in return, and if they feel like there are other moves after that that would make this a more balanced and complete roster.
Yeah, because, I mean, as you said, I don't think the Cavs are a win now team. They're not a championship now team, but they understand that these windows are closing. Donovan Mitchell ain't getting any younger. Evan Mobley's still growing, but he's not getting any younger. So it's like, you think about those things, but the thing that got me about Evan Mobley and his 3-point shot, and I'm going to end the podcast with this, Chris. Evan Mobley went on to the sideline he left to get an arthroscopic knee surgery. Saw that the Cavs said, we're going to go and shoot all of these threes because we need to make up for the offense we lost with you and Darius Garland being out at the same time. Not even like a second later. It was like a split-second decision. When we see Evan Mobley coming back, he says, I need to shoot more threes if I want to continue to be in this lineup. And there's a different push and a different pressure when you put on guys that they understand that they want to be on the court. They want to be playing as much as possible. They want to be making an impact. And we know how much of, I want to say perfectionist Evan Mobley is, because he always wants to make the right play, make the right read. And if he's sitting on the outside, catches the ball, and he's like, well, I don't have the confidence to shoot this, I can't shoot it. So now that he's gaining that confidence, it showed me that even from that middle earlier on in the season, when he got hurt and came back and started shooting more threes, got more confidence, it only tells me that this entire off season, you have the entire off season to work on your 3-point shot. Like, I remember when we were at practices, shoot arounds, it was much more that we were seeing Evan Mobley shoot and work on that 3-point shot. And that was during the season. So now that he has isolated time to get that and get those things just under rep, I think it's the possibility of him taking that jump that we know that he needs, not only for the Cavs to take that next step, but for potentially the Cavs to keep Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley together.
But there's also no guarantee. That's the
100%. Yep.
Right. There's no guarantee that he becomes a 35% 3-point shooter or a 37% 3-point shooter. Maybe just for his career, it's going to be low volume, low 30s, something like that. You know what I mean? Like, we can't sit here and say that he's going to become Karl Anthony Towns, or he's going to become, Kyle Kuzma in terms of style player, or he's going to become Jeremy Grant, or whatever other four you want to talk about in that kind of mold, where they've got the inside-outside game, where they've got more of a reliable outside shot, more of a reliable perimeter game. Not everybody that wants to be a better 3-point shooter is going to become a better 3-point shooter. It takes a lot of work. It takes a certain skill set. It takes a certain kind of makeup. You know what I'm saying? So I'm with you. Like, I think it's something that he's going to focus on this offseason, and I never count out Evan when it comes to these kinds of things, because I know how hard he works, and I know how much he wants to be great at something. And if he puts his mind to it, there isn't something that he hasn't been able to accomplish in his career that he's put his mind to. But I also, like I said, there is no guarantee that he becomes that, or he becomes the capable stretch forward that the Cavs would need him to be a better fit alongside Jarrett Allen.
Yeah, I mean, that puts everything in perspective, because we know that as of right now, Evan Mobley is the starting power forward, and we know that Dean Wade and Georges Niang, as of right now, are duking it out for that backup power forward role. And we know that Georges Niang, if he wants to come out on the end of that backup power forward role, doesn't want to be the 9 or 10 guy to Dean Wade's 8 or 9. You think about him needing to show what he can grow in his game when it comes to defensively, when it comes to continuously making shots, getting back to the 40% 3-point percent shooting that he had done his entire career. So that's how these guys kind of go together and can work together to get better, because we know that this locker room, they're not, oh, it's me versus you. It's how can I push you to be your best self, and that also pushing me to be my best self. But with all that being said, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs insider and interact with Chris and me by subscribing to Subtext. Sign up for a 14-day free trial, or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. If you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word STOP. It's easy, but we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around, because this is the best way to get insider coverage on the Cavs from me and Chris. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through Subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.